May 1st, 1943, over the blood-stained skies of Saint-Nazaire, France. A B-17 Flying Fortress, aircraft number 4229649, is dying. Flames erupt through the fuselage like dragons, breathing fire through metal bones. 3 crewmen have already bailed out into the freezing air, choosing the uncertain mercy of German capture over the certainty of burning alive. In the tail section, the wounded tail gunner stares forward through the smoke and sees something that defies all logic and reason. A short, 31-year-old ball turret gunner who'd been the squadron joke just hours earlier. The man everyone called Snuffy because he looked like a character from a comic strip, was crawling through an inferno toward him. This man, Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith, shouldn't even be on this mission. He'd been a last-minute replacement, flying his very first combat sortie, while experienced gunners waited at base. He had absolutely no business being in a war zone, let alone fighting his way through flames hot enough to melt aluminum. But sometimes, history doesn't choose its heroes from the ranks of the qualified and prepared. Sometimes it picks the most unlikely person imaginable and asks them to do the impossible. And on this particular day, over the submarine pens of occupied France, that's exactly what happened. Let's rewind 24 hours and understand who Maynard Snuffy Smith really was, because his story makes what happened that day even more remarkable. Born in Cairo, Michigan, in 1911, Smith was never anyone's idea of military material. He stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, rail-thin, the face that looked perpetually weathered, despite his relatively young age. Before the war, he drifted through a series of unremarkable jobs, working odd positions that never quite stuck. Married to a woman named Mary, with whom he had 2 children, but no real stability. When Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, 30-year-old Smith saw military service as perhaps his last chance to make something of his chaotic life. To finally prove he was worth something beyond another factory paycheck and another mundane existence, but the Army Air Forces didn't exactly welcome him with open arms. His superiors at the 306th Bombardment Group, 423rd Bombardment Squadron, stationed at Thurles in England, viewed Smith as fundamentally unsuited for the brutal realities of high-altitude combat over Nazi-occupied Europe. He was older than most gunners, shorter than desirable for the cramped ball turret position, and possessed a personality that alternated between sullen silence and inappropriate humor that rubbed officers and enlisted men alike the wrong way. Other crews had nicknamed him Snuffy after the hillbilly comic strip character Snuffy Smith, partly because of his appearance but mostly as a form of mockery. Nobody wanted to fly with Snuffy Smith. He was considered the kind of liability that got good men killed through incompetence or panic when the fighters swarmed and the flak turned the sky black with exploding steel. The morning of May 1st, 1943, started with Maynard Smith not even scheduled to fly. The 306th Bomb Group was preparing for a major strike against the German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, a heavily fortified complex on the French Atlantic coast that the bomber crews had grimly nicknamed Flak City. The anti-aircraft defenses there were among the deadliest in occupied Europe. Smith had been watching from the ground as other crews went through their pre-flight rituals, probably feeling that familiar mixture of relief at not being chosen and shame at being passed over yet again. But war has a way of creating sudden vacancies, and when a scheduled ball turret gunner reported sick at the last minute, someone made a fateful decision to plug the hole in the crew roster with the one available replacement nobody wanted: Snuffy Smith. The ball turret position on a B-17 was arguably the most terrifying station on any combat aircraft in existence. Imagine being sealed into a sphere barely 3 feet in diameter, suspended beneath the belly of the bomber like a glass bubble, with nothing between you and empty space except a thin sheet of plexiglass and 2 .50 caliber machine guns. You couldn't wear a parachute in that cramped sphere because there simply wasn't room. If the aircraft was hit and going down, you had to somehow rotate the turret to the correct position, manually crank open the hatch, squeeze yourself back up into the fuselage, locate your parachute, strap it on, and then bail out. All while the aircraft was potentially spinning toward Earth and enemy fighters were still shooting. Most ball turret gunners who went down with their aircraft never made it out of that sphere. They died trapped in that tiny bubble, watching the ground rush up to meet them with horrifying clarity through the transparent dome. As Smith squeezed himself into the ball turret that morning, curling into the fetal position that the job required, rotating the turret to hang suspended beneath the aircraft like an exposed target, he had no illusions about what Flak City meant. The submarine pens at St. Nazaire were protected by hundreds of German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, positioned in overlapping fields of fire that turned the airspace over the target into a killing zone where every cubic foot of sky could be filled with exploding shrapnel designed to rip aircraft apart. The Luftwaffe fighter squadrons stationed nearby were some of Germany's most experienced units. Pilots who'd been hunting American bombers since the daylight bombing campaign began and had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the B-17's vulnerabilities. The mission briefing had been brutally honest about expected casualties. Some crews wouldn't be coming back. Some aircraft would return so damaged they'd never fly again. Some men would bail out over France and spend the rest of the war in prison camps if they were lucky, or be killed by fighters while dangling helplessly from parachutes if they weren't. The formation of Set B-8 B-17s from multiple bomb groups climbed through the cold morning air over England. Heading southeast toward the French coast, inside Smith's bomber, the crew settled into their stations with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. The pilot and co-pilot up front focused on holding tight formation because scattered bombers were dead bombers. The navigator hunched over his maps and instruments, calculating headings and fuel consumption with slide rule precision, the bombardier preparing his Norden bomb sight for the run-over target, the radio operator monitoring frequencies for recall orders or emergency messages, the engineer at the top turret scanning for fighters with eyes that never stopped moving, the waist gunners on either side of the fuselage checking their weapons and ammunition belts, the tail gunner in his isolated position at the very back, the loneliest station on the aircraft, where you watched the rest of the formation and waited for enemy fighters to attack from behind. And beneath them all, in his vulnerable glass sphere, Maynard Smith rotated his turret constantly, scanning the sky below and to the sides. Knowing that German fighters loved to attack from beneath, where the B-17's armor was thinnest, they crossed the French coast, and the flak started immediately. Black puffs of smoke blossoming in the formation like deadly flowers, each explosion sending thousands of jagged steel fragments screaming through the air at supersonic speeds. A near miss could shred control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, kill crewmen, or sever critical hydraulic lines. A direct hit could blow a bomber out of the sky instantly, scattering men and machinery across miles of French countryside. Smith felt his aircraft shudder and buck as concussion waves from nearby explosions pushed against the fuselage, like invisible giant hands trying to swat them from the sky. Through his plexiglass dome, he could see other bombers in the formation taking hits, trailing smoke, falling out of position. One B-17 simply exploded in a massive fireball that consumed the entire aircraft in less than a second, vaporizing 10 men before they even had time to understand they were dying. He watched parachutes blossom beneath the formation as damaged bombers shed their crews, tiny white mushrooms drifting down toward uncertain fates in occupied territory. Then came the fighters. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s diving out of the sun, their machine guns and cannons hammering the formation with concentrated firepower that could tear a bomber to pieces in seconds. Smith rotated his turret frantically, trying to track targets that flashed past at combined closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour. He squeezed his triggers, sending streams of 50 caliber tracers toward German fighters that danced through the flak, and friendly fire with the kind of aggressive flying that came from years of combat experience. The sound inside his turret was overwhelming, his own guns hammering away, the screaming of fighters passing close enough to see the pilots' faces, the deeper thunder of 20mm cannon shells punching through aluminum like it was paper. The shouts and screams on the intercom as crewmen called out targets and damage reports and pleas for help. The bombs dropped away, and the formation turned for home. But St. Nazaire wasn't finished with them yet. As they crossed back over the coast, heading for the relative safety of the English Channel, Smith's aircraft took a direct hit from an 88mm anti-aircraft shell that exploded inside the radio room. The blast was catastrophic. It instantly killed the radio operator, a young man whose name Smith had barely learned. The explosion severed the oxygen lines to the rear of the aircraft, meaning everyone behind the bomb bay was now breathing air that was deadly thin at 25,000 feet altitude. Within minutes, without supplemental oxygen, a man would lose consciousness and die from hypoxia. But even more immediately dangerous than the oxygen loss was the fire. The explosion had ignited something, probably hydraulic fluid or spilled fuel, and flames were spreading through the fuselage with terrifying speed. From his position in the ball turret, Smith couldn't see the fire at first, but he could hear the panic on the intercom. Voices shouting about flames, about damage, about the need to bail out immediately before the aircraft exploded. The intercom went dead, either from damage or because someone had deliberately cut it to avoid spreading panic. Smith rotated his turret and looked up through the small window into the fuselage, and what he saw must have stopped his heart. Orange flames were roaring through the interior of the aircraft, consuming everything combustible. Spreading toward the wing tanks were thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel weighted to turn the entire bomber into an airborne crematorium. Through the smoke, he could see figures moving toward the waste door. Crewmen preparing to jump, choosing escape over the horror of burning alive. 3 men bailed out in quick succession, both waste gunners and the radio operator's assistant, vanishing into the slipstream with their parachutes trailing behind them like silk ribbons. The tail gunner, wounded by shrapnel from the flak hit, couldn't move from his position. He was trapped back there, isolated behind a wall of fire. Unable to reach his parachute, even if he could somehow crawl forward through the flames, this was the moment that would define Maynard Harrison Smith's entire existence. Every humiliation, every failure, every time someone had called him worthless or incompetent or a joke, all of it came down to this single decision point. He was the ball turret gunner, which meant he had the clearest path to bail out. His position had its own access hatch. He could rotate the turret, crank himself back into the fuselage, grab his parachute, and jump. Nobody would question that decision. The aircraft was clearly doomed, already on fire, losing altitude, possibly minutes or even seconds from exploding. Bailing out was the reasonable choice, the smart choice, the choice that would let him survive to see his wife and children again. But Maynard Smith didn't bail out. Instead, he did something that even he probably couldn't fully explain in rational terms. He cranked his turret to the access position, squeezed himself back up into the burning fuselage, and instead of heading for the escape hatch, he grabbed a fire extinguisher and started fighting the fire. The heat inside that fuselage must have been absolutely hellish. Aluminum skin superheated to temperatures that would blister skin on contact. Smoke so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet. The roar of flames competing with the scream of wind through dozens of shrapnel holes that turned the fuselage into a supersonic wind tunnel. Smith couldn't wear his oxygen mask while fighting the fire because he needed to see what he was doing, which meant he was operating at 25,000 feet with no supplemental oxygen. His body and brain rapidly being starved of the air they needed to function. Every second he spent in those conditions brought him closer to hypoxia-induced unconsciousness that would kill him as surely as the flames. He sprayed the fire extinguisher at the worst of the flames, but it was like trying to fight a forest fire with a garden hose. The extinguisher ran dry, and the fire was still spreading. Smith threw the empty canister aside and looked around desperately for anything else that could help. He found ammunition cans that had been superheated by the fire and were in danger of cooking off, which would turn the interior of the aircraft into a shrapnel-filled death trap. Using his bare hands, Smith grabbed those burning metal cans and threw them out through the holes in the fuselage, accepting the burns on his palms and fingers as acceptable prices for preventing the ammunition from exploding and killing. Everyone's still aboard. He found another fire extinguisher and continued fighting, spraying chemical foam at flames that kept reigniting from the wind, feeding fresh oxygen through all those holes. When that extinguisher ran dry, Smith did something that would become legendary in Air Force history, though accounts vary on exactly how it happened. According to some versions, he urinated on the flames, using his own body fluids as improvised fire suppressant. Other accounts suggest he used water from the aircraft's limited supply, or beat at flames with his hands and pieces of clothing. The specific details matter less than the fundamental reality. Maynard Smith was fighting an aircraft fire at 25,000 feet with inadequate equipment, no oxygen, and injuries that should have incapacitated him. Because somewhere behind that wall of smoke and flame was a wounded tail gunner who couldn't save himself. For 25 minutes, Smith fought that fire alone. 25 minutes that must have felt like hours, each second an eternity of heat and pain and smoke and exhaustion. His lungs were seared from breathing superheated air. His hands were burned from handling hot metal. His vision was blurred from smoke and lack of oxygen. His body was screaming at him to give up, to save himself, to just let go and accept the inevitable. But Smith kept fighting. He beat at flames with his jacket. He scattered burning debris. He threw smoldering equipment out through the holes. He crawled through smoke so thick he was navigating by touch and memory. And somehow, impossibly, he began to win. The flames started to subside. The immediate danger of total fire consuming the aircraft began to recede. The bomber was still critically damaged, still losing altitude, still in danger of breaking apart from structural damage. But it was no longer an airborne funeral pyre. Once Smith had the fire under partial control, he did something even more remarkable. He made his way back through the smoke-filled fuselage to where the wounded tail gunner was trapped, unable to move because of his injuries and the lack of oxygen. Smith found the young man barely conscious, his face pale from blood loss and hypoxia, eyes glazed with the look of someone who'd accepted he was going to die. Smith grabbed him, and in a moment that the tail gunner would recount for the rest of his life, he saw this short-burned, smoke-blackened figure lean in close and shout something that got lost in the wind. Noise, but communicated through sheer force of will. "You're not dying today." Smith dragged the wounded gunner forward, away from his isolated position to where he could provide at least some first aid and keep pressure on his wounds. Then, because the fire wasn't completely out and could reignite at any moment, Smith went back to fighting the flames, alternating between fire suppression and checking on the wounded tail gunner, somehow managing to do the work of 3 men while operating on fumes and adrenaline and stubborn refusal to quit. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot were fighting their own desperate battle to keep the crippled bomber airborne. The aircraft had sustained massive damage from the flak hit and subsequent fire. Control surfaces were compromised. The hydraulic system was failing. Multiple engines were running rough from debris ingestion or battle damage. They'd lost thousands of feet of altitude and were now down to around 10,000 feet, where they could at least breathe without supplemental oxygen, but were much more vulnerable to any remaining German fighters that might spot a damaged bomber struggling alone and see an easy kill. The pilot, whose name has been lost to most accounts, but who deserves recognition for incredible flying skill, somehow managed to nurse that devastated B-17 across the English Channel. He kept it in the air through skill and prayers and probably some measure of luck, fighting controls that responded sluggishly or not at all, compensating for damage he couldn't even fully assess because he couldn't leave his seat to inspect the fuselage. When they finally crossed back over the English coast and approached their home field at Thurla, the ground crews who came out to watch them land couldn't believe the aircraft was still flying. The fuselage looked like it had been put through an industrial shredder and then set on fire for good measure. There were hundreds of holes from flak and fighter cannon, some large enough to stick your arm through. The entire midsection was blackened with fire damage and smoke stains. The tail section was barely attached, held on primarily by cables and prayers. When Smith finally climbed out of the aircraft and his boots touched solid English soil again, he literally collapsed from exhaustion, burns, smoke inhalation, and the aftermath of operating at extreme altitude without oxygen for an extended period. Medics rushed to help him and the wounded tail gunner, while other crewmen stood around the devastated bomber in stunned silence, trying to process how anyone had survived inside that flying wreck, let alone brought it home. Of the 78 B-17s that had set out that morning to bomb St. Nazaire, 7 had been lost entirely, shot down or destroyed, with all crew killed or captured. Many others returned with severe damage and wounded crewmen. But Smith's aircraft had sustained damage that should have been absolutely fatal. The kind of catastrophic fire that normally meant instant bailout orders and a bomber lost to enemy territory. The fact that it had made it home was being called miraculous. When investigators examined the aircraft and interviewed the surviving crew members, the story that emerged was one of almost superhuman courage from the most unlikely source imaginable. The man everyone had dismissed as incompetent, the gunner nobody wanted flying with them, the joke nicknamed Snuffy. It saved that aircraft and everyone still aboard through sheer determination and refusal to accept defeat. The Army Air Forces moved quickly to recognize Smith's actions, partly because they were genuinely heroic, and partly because the service desperately needed positive stories during a period when the daylight bombing campaign was taking horrific casualties and public support needed bolstering. On July 15, 1943, just 2.5 months after the mission, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson personally presented Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony at Thurla Air Base in front of assembled crews and press photographers. Smith became the first enlisted member of the United States Army Air Forces in Europe to receive the nation's highest award for valor, and the citation read like something from an adventure novel, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, above and beyond the call of duty. Fighting fire and fumes, succeeded in extinguishing the fire by hand, fought the fire for more than 90 minutes, working in conditions of extreme danger with complete disregard for his own safety. The ceremony was covered by news organizations across America, and suddenly Maynard Snuffy Smith wasn't a joke anymore. He was a hero, his photograph appearing in newspapers from coast to coast, his story told on radio broadcasts, his example held up to inspire others. But here's where Smith's story takes a turn that makes it even more human and complicated. Because real heroes aren't perfect people from Hollywood scripts. They're flawed human beings who do extraordinary things despite their limitations. And sometimes those limitations resurface even after moments of incredible heroism. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Smith was sent back to the United States for a war bond tour, appearing at rallies and events to inspire support for the war effort. But the fame and attention didn't sit well with him. He wasn't a natural public speaker or comfortable with celebrity. He'd done what he did on that burning aircraft, not for glory or recognition, but because in that moment it was simply what needed to be done, and nobody else was there to do it. The manufactured heroism of bond tours and scripted speeches felt fake to him. Hollow, compared to the real terror and urgency of fighting that fire at 25,000 feet. Smith's military service after the Medal of Honor ceremony was rocky. He was never promoted beyond staff sergeant, highly unusual for Medal of Honor recipients who typically received automatic advancement. There were disciplinary issues, conflicts with officers. Now, the same personality problems that had made him unpopular before his moment of heroism. The Medal of Honor didn't magically transform Maynard Smith into a different person. He was still short-tempered, still difficult, still the same flawed man who'd always struggled with authority and fitting into military culture. But none of that diminishes what he did on May 1st, 1943. None of the later difficulties erased those 25 minutes when he became something more than himself. When he reached down into depths he probably didn't know he possessed, and pulled out the courage to fight an impossible fight and refuse to let his fellow crewmen die, Maynard Smith survived the war and returned to civilian life, where he struggled with many of the same challenges that had plagued him before military service. He worked various jobs, dealt with health problems related to his injuries and smoke inhalation, and never quite achieved the stable life he'd hoped military service would provide. He remained married to Mary, raised his children, and lived quietly in the Midwest, rarely talking about his wartime experiences. The fame from his Medal of Honor faded as America moved on from World War II into new conflicts and new concerns. Smith wasn't bothered by the fading spotlight. He'd never sought it in the first place. When he died on May 11, 1984, just 8 days before what would have been his 73rd birthday, his obituaries retold the story of that burning B-17 over St. Nazaire. But by then, most Americans had forgotten who Maynard Snuffy Smith was or why his story mattered. But his story matters enormously. precisely because of who Maynard Smith was and wasn't. He wasn't a natural-born warrior. He wasn't someone who'd excelled at every challenge life threw at him. He wasn't the kind of person you'd pick from a lineup if you were assembling a team of heroes. He was short, difficult, middle-aged by military standards, the butt of jokes, the gunner nobody wanted on their crew. He was in almost every measurable way unremarkable. And that's exactly why his story resonates so powerfully. Because it demonstrates something fundamental about human courage and potential. Heroism isn't the exclusive property of the naturally brave or the obviously talented. It doesn't belong only to the people who look like heroes or act like heroes in everyday life. Sometimes heroism emerges from the most unlikely places, from the people nobody expects. In moments when circumstances demand more than we think we can give, and we somehow reach deep enough to find it anyway. On May 1st, 1943, over the burning skies of Saint-Nazaire, France, a 31-year-old ball turret gunner who'd been the squadron joke that morning became a Medal of Honor recipient by nightfall. Not because he was special or different or naturally heroic, but because when fire consumed his aircraft and everyone else bailed out and a wounded tail gunner waited in the smoke to die, Maynard Snuffy Smith made a choice. He chose to fight instead of flee. He chose to endure pain and danger for strangers who'd mocked him. He chose to believe that one small man with inadequate equipment and no backup could somehow make a difference against flames and fate. And for 25 impossible minutes at 25,000 feet, he was absolutely right. That's not just a story about one man's courage. It's a story about human potential, about the extraordinary capabilities that exist within ordinary people. Waiting for the moment when circumstances demand we become more than we thought we could be. It's a reminder that the person next to you, the one you might dismiss or overlook or underestimate, might be carrying inside them the seeds of incredible heroism that will only emerge when everything is on fire. And the easy choice is to run, and they decide to stay and fight instead. The misfit, who became a hero, the joke who saved lives. The man nobody wanted who refused to let his crew die. That's the real story of Maynard Snuffy Smith. And it's worth remembering not because he was perfect, but precisely because he wasn't. Because if someone like Snuffy Smith could do what he did, then maybe any of us, in our own moments of crisis and decision, might find within ourselves the courage to do what needs doing, regardless of the cost, regardless of the odds, regardless of whether anyone ever thanks us for it or remembers our names. Sometimes that's what heroism really looks like. Not a perfect person making obvious choices, but a deeply flawed human being deciding that right now in this moment, someone else's life matters more than their own safety. And on May 1st, 1943, over the blood-stained skies of France, that decision made all the difference.